was part of Dr. Thurman's understanding of worship. It was a very powerful method of worship. And again, his daughter, Olive Thurman, was one who really developed a lot in terms of it. We have a stage downstairs. That was her calling to work with theater. Dr. Howard Thurman reflected on the importance of this new venture, the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, with the following words. The movement of the Spirit of God in the hearts of people often calls them to act against the spirit of their times, or causes them to anticipate a spirit which is yet in the making. That was his reflection on the Fellowship Church. And it's one of the reasons I have been so interested in having such a forum. I think we're at that time again when the Spirit is calling us for something different, to calling us to anticipate a spirit which is yet in the making. As I said earlier, I believe that the present system really does not promote the general welfare of the people, does not promote a sense of common ground, does not understand the dignity and respect due to all people. And I don't feel this can be accomplished through our corporate domination of the system. Values that are dear to us, justice, peace, compassion, are consistently being betrayed and in fact are in hospice, as I see it, without the possibility of being resurrected through our current forms of government and political exploitation and economic exploitation. Yet, there are examples of alternative ways of organizing life that have been and are emerging. Our panelists are involved in such alternatives. They have been invited here to inform us of the seeds. Again, your pamphlet, we're talking about seeds. The seeds that have been and are being planted that should aid us in seeing ways forward, new paths to beloved community. There's a quotation in your package that talks about these seeds, and that grounds our time together here. Seeds have been planted, and therefore, as the quote says, we should expect wonders. Our first panelist to speak will be Gus Newport. I asked Gus to be the first speaker because Gus has been out here for so many years on the cutting edge, the growing edge of society and community. And I wanted him, he's been around to give some kind of, he has such a wonderful historical perspective. You have taken 15 seconds, go to your pamphlet, and look at the description of, or the bio on Gus Newport. I just want to take 15 seconds for you to go look at Gus Newport. Yes. I did that because I wanted you to let that absorb, some of his bio. That's a very minimal bio for Gus Newport. And I can't spend the kind of time I would like in terms of introducing all of these speakers, but I want to say that in addition to what you have printed, Gus Newport will be speaking at the United Nations in November. He was vice president of the World Peace Council. Every year, he speaks to my classes at PSR, both the fall course and the spring semester course, and every year students just are amazed at the wealth of his understanding. He has been so committed, and one of the things I do want to lift up is the work he did with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Roxbury, because it's such an important example of what could happen in our nation. There was a community where people drove in from the outside and literally dumped trash, garbage, in the community. There were landlords who would ignite their property through arson to get insurance payment. And he was part of the group that brought together people from various racial backgrounds, faith backgrounds. And it was the first place in the nation, I don't want to take too much away from Gus, to call for eminent domain from the city. And they were able to get the property and develop it, housing for the people there. So it's a great pleasure to introduce a friend of mine. We've journeyed together for many years. It's always a pleasure to be in his presence. He's just come back from a very important meeting in New York. He came back last night. Gus Newport, former mayor of Berkeley, known all across not only this nation but internationally for his work in community development.
He says he's mic'd on his lapel.
He's got a lapel. Yeah, he's got a lapel mic.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Courtney? I will say one other thing about Gus. Gus is a Howard Thurman Award recipient a few years ago. So we gave him a Howard Thurman Award.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am pleased to be here to participate in the Dorsey Blake Forum for Social Justice. Are you hearing me? Yes. Typically, social justice is associated with the ideas of equality, freedom, and common good. Many believe it has lost its meaning and has become more of a buzzword for activists and campaigners. It's easy to think of what it is not. It's not gender inequality, government censorship, racism, or homophobia. As Dorsey said, I just returned last night from meetings the past couple of weeks in New York, Alabama, and Georgia. And when he refers to how far back I go, my granddaughter was 19 in her sophomore year at Loyola tells me, Papa, you know, you're 4 years old in baseball. I'm 84 years old. But I'd like to say that everything that I've come through in life has created me, or prepared me, I think, for the greater community, the community which Martin Luther King used to refer to. My meeting most recently in New York was a meeting of a call on the civil right of education. I don't know how many people know it, but education is not a constitutional right in the United States. It was put on the agenda in the 50s by the president of Harvard, gone to committee several times, but to this day, the Constitution of the United States does not see education as a constitutional right. I am very sad, and I used to chair the board for Bob Moses' Algebra Project. And we campaigned all across the country to try to make people aware of that. And everybody's surprised when they hear it. But you know, the other sad thing about America is that history is not truly recorded. It's at best propaganda. How else do you think you could perpetuate the conditions which keep us going? Right now we're talking about probably impeaching or things like that. But it's all based on our Constitution. But remember one thing, that Constitution was written by white men for white men. Women couldn't vote, blacks couldn't vote, a variety of things. And that Constitution is still serving those white men who get away with these kinds of things, who have risen to those levels. And so we had this meeting about education, and when I heard when the day's meeting started, and Brian put on a song from Sweet Honey in the Rock, I thought, God, I'm in heaven again, because Sweet Honey in the Rock just performed 2 days ago in New York at this session I was there. I said, God, look at here, boy, it's going to be all right. But what we were talking about is creating an intergenerational thing, young people and old people, and it reminds me, I'm a member of the National Council of Elders, which was founded by Vincent Vincent wrote the speech, A Time to Break the Silence Against the Vietnam War. And Vincent was one of the most beautiful people, PhD in theology, that I have ever known. But isn't it a shame what we have to go through? And I want you to see the differences because what this country has created. Remember what Martin, the hell he caught for giving that speech at Riverside Church? By the black leadership, by the Democrat Party, by everybody else, because he was against us participating in war. As Muhammad Ali said, as Malcolm X said, as he said, the Vietnamese didn't do anything to us. These are people of color, why are we going there? And Harry Belafonte, who I had the good fortune, I've known for years, I spent 3 hours with earlier this week, says at 17, I went into the Navy to fight supposedly for the freedom of this country. But when I got back, I had discussions with men of color who was in militaries all over the world. And these ones said, what are we fighting for? We go back home and we're treated like pigs from these racist standpoints. So some of us come back and decide, let's aspire to that beloved community under all circumstances. Yesterday I had a meeting at Project South that represents 17 southern states around community development, economic development, and whatever else. And one of the things we decided that we're going to do is begin looking at drawing up a new constitution for the people of this country, based on principles, etc., whatever else. My journey has taken me a lot of places. My grandmother, who in the 4th grade in Virginia, went to school late one morning after picking cotton. She walks into school, a white teacher slaps her without even asking a question. She walked out and never went back. But she became an avid reader. They got married real young in those days. She got married at 16. She had a daughter. Her husband got wounded in mine. She moved to Pittsburgh where she had relatives and did to Rochester, New York, where I was born. She started taking me to see Paul Robeson and Marian Anderson when I was 5 years old. Took me to the Philharmonic and things like that, the cultural things that build that system of esteem and love for what a society should be. I have a picture of my grandmother on the right wall and a picture of my mother at the end of my bed. So every night when I go to sleep, I see them and their spirit just reeks, and when I wake up in the morning, God has blessed me again. Neither one of them finished school, but they were both some of the greatest community organizers I'd ever known. I was the first in my family to go to college. I went to Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio. I wasn't really prepared, but I dropped out my sophomore year. I got drafted into the military. Coincidentally, I went from Heidelberg University and I was stationed in Heidelberg, Germany. But my responsibility, being in intelligence, was looking at boat locators of all the boats that the American military had throughout the world. I started asking too many questions. They put me out early with an honorable discharge. So when I come back to Rochester, police brutality is running rampant. Because of my family, I become head of the biggest civil rights group in Roanoke County Nonpartisan Political League. And we had a gas station attendant, a black one, closed up in station one night, get beat within an inch of his life. And they asked me to take on that case. It became the first case won in the federal court, the Federal Civil Rights Court. But what I began to learn more about, the policeman who beat him was an Italian guy who went to a Catholic high school, who beat a nun to within an inch of her life when he was in high school. So background checks are never really looked at for those kinds of things. We wonder why this police brutality and stuff is going on, et cetera, and whatever else. So I did that, and 2 weeks later, the police invaded the Black Muslim mosque. Daisy Bates was in Rochester organizing for the NAACP. Malcolm X called Daisy and said, Daisy, I'm coming to Rochester. Who should I be in touch with? She gave him my phone number. You can imagine my surprise when Malcolm X calls me and talks for 2 hours. And he did it every night for 2 weeks. And he flew into Rochester on a cold winter's February day. In Rochester, New York, it's cold. It's on Lake right across from Canada. And I'm sitting inside the airport waiting for Malcolm when the planes land on the tarmac in those days outside. And I'm surrounded by all these white men in white shirts, felt hats, and Malcolm walks in the airport. He said, who is Gus Newport? Because we never see each other. I said, I am. He said, young blood, you got the best tap telephone in America. This is all FBI here. Within 24 hours, the New York State Legislature passed a law that Malcolm X could not speak in any institution that had government funding or foundation funding. But we got together, and Malcolm came back, and Malcolm, as you know later, left the Nation of Islam, created Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Then he asked me to help him create the Organization of Afro-American Unity. I was traveling with Malcolm. I traveled to Rochester for him to speak at Cooperative Divinity 4 days before he was assassinated. And he told me on the way, he said, Gus, I'm a dead man. I know it. I've got the intelligence out of it. But the thing that was amazing, he said, but I will not stop what I'm doing for the maintenance of my life. So back to New York, we were met by the chief of police and the fire marshal, who both accused him of putting his own house on fire. It's the only time in my life I heard Malcolm cuss. He used some words that I'd never heard before. His wife Betty was there to pick him up to take him back downtown to meet with Alex Haley, who was writing his autobiography. She was pregnant, carrying twins. And then, all right, I see the time is short, he's telling me. I want to talk about a lot of things. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, what he referred to, is the only nonprofit organization in the history of the United States to get eminent domain authority through creating a master plan, through what's on the books going back to the 1800s of Massachusetts. We finally created a master plan, what it should be, and then we created a land trust, which this young woman spoke of. I was in charge of the nation's organization before Grounded Solutions for land trust and whatever else I'd like to talk to you. But it took all these things. I wish I had more time. He's already showed me time is up. But what I'm saying is we have to be interactive. And my grandmother, even though she left school in the 4th grade, when she moved to Rochester, we lived in a segregated community, even in the north. And a lot of white school teachers moved into our neighborhood because it was affordable, single. My grandmother used to host a reception every time one of those young teachers came in and have us kids refer to those teachers as Aunt Jane and Aunt Joe from the old Southern proverb of how youngsters spoke to older people and whatever else. She only told me after Malcolm X came to speak to me, she felt out there that her mother was a slave who was blinded by the plantation boss and the problems she went through. But they believed in that beloved community. It was through the church. Charles Body was our minister, who we had head of the American National Baptist Association in Nashville, Tennessee. And so integration and working together for the good of people. And the foundation for what we are reaching out for, trying to change, is love, love, love. It's built on love. What else should we be aspiring to but a better society? My biggest concern is, what is the future for my granddaughter, the next generation? And I'm so proud to see these young people involved in our environmental, etc., and what they're doing. That we have a president that does not even believe that what the scientists are saying, etc., and whatever else. How could we be such a divided country? And I see my time is up. I wish I could stay up here and talk forever because I'd like to share more. Huh?
During our panel later, we'll have some
okay. All right.
We'll come back after.
I'll share more. Thank you very much. I love you all.
So now what we ask is scoot over so that you can sit next to somebody and take a minute to say what is in you based on what you just heard from Gus. And then after a minute, I'm going to ring the bell like this and ask you to then switch, and you'll have a minute. Go. Did you ever go to Clay's ice cream? The next speaker, and Dr. Blake will now introduce our next speaker.
The next speaker that we planned to have was Carl Anthony Many of you know Carl Anthony and his extraordinary work in terms of environmentalism, transportation, and so on. Carl called yesterday and he's in the hospital. So that is the reason he is not here. He tried to convince the doctors to let him out for a day or whatever. And they said absolutely not. He needed to take a very serious, very important test today, a very important procedure. So he expressed his regret. And I hope that one of these days we'll be able to have Carl back here at the church to do something as well as the rest of these wonderful speakers. So Carl is not going to be able to be with us today, and again, I regret that. Our next speaker, I want to go to Deseree Fontenot and look at the program and look at her bio. Just take a few minutes to look at the wonderful things that she's done. The idea behind some of this was to have Gus and Carl, who've been out there for a while doing these wonderful things in the community and their legacy from generations, then to have some of the younger people to come up and express themselves. I would say, Desiree, not only what you have in your bulletin, in your program, but Desiree was a student at Pacific School of Religion and was extraordinary. I was graced to have her in my class, and she wrote some of the most comprehensive papers I've ever read, with depth. She's able to synthesize material in a remarkable way. And she also was head of, worked very seriously with the LGBT community in terms of there's a special program there, and she was program director. But Desiree, I'm so happy to see that you're still out there. You're still out there doing some marvelous.
Thank you.
We're playing musical things with the microphones because they can hear downstairs with this mic, but not with the other.
Okay.
So that's the reason we're doing this.
Thank you. Access clarity.
And Desiree, could you tell us a little bit too, as you're talking about your idea of the love community?
Yes.
And how we're going to get it? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Blake. It was an honor to be in your class, and my introduction to Howard Thurman. I feel like the quote that stays with me and probably so many other people is, ask not what the world needs, but what makes you come alive.
Yeah.
People who come alive, and that was such a grounding experience for me, so thank you. So jumping into the framing question, what does beloved community mean to me? As a farmer, a gardener, a total earth nerd person, and as someone who's worked at Community Land Trust, has worked in the LGBTQ movement for 10 years, and now I work at Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. Beloved community, to me, is a vision where we're in deep dynamic relationship with all our relatives. Right? Given the scale, pace, and intensity of the ecological crisis that we're in, our vision for beloved community has to include all our relationships to the systems and the rhythms and the cycles of everything happening on this planet. It's a vision where we see ourselves as part of healthy and regenerative ecosystems and not separate from them. It's a vision where we meet our needs at a scale and a pace that's in alignment with living systems, right? Like, how do we think of ourselves as organizers with the water cycle, with the soil cycles that we're a part of, with the very web of life that we depend on and that we are completely, deeply interconnected with, right? It's a big piece of what does it look like to heal disconnection, not just between our human communities, but with all life on this planet. And it's the question of our time. What attracted me to Movement Generation is that there have been an organization for the last 12 years closing the gap on the conversations of racial and economic justice and ecological justice. And for me, how we get there, the most comprehensive vision that I've seen has come out of Movement Generation's Just Transition framework, is what we call it. And it's a vision that encompasses what we believe ecological justice is. So the idea of a just transition comes out of 40 plus years of labor and environmental justice movements, organizing to phase out toxic industries from their communities that were harming workers, the community, and the planet's health, and build just pathways towards new, regenerative, sustainable livelihoods, right? So rooted in that history, the just transition concept that that's been developed by Movement Generation in collaboration with EJ organizers, indigenous organizers over the last 10 years, takes that idea and builds it into this larger picture of what does holistic economic transformation look like? What would it look like to move whole communities out of our current dominant economy, which we call the extractive economy, into new, thriving, regenerative economies, recognizing that we're going to have a multiplicity of forms, right? We have problems that are so huge and large scale that there's not going to be a single solution, right? So the Just Transition Framework is a way that, it's a tool that a lot of folks have used to build unified strategies for how do we get there. I'm not gonna be able to do it justice in 10 minutes, but I wanted to give y'all a snippet of 4 of the central principles of the Just Transition. So the first one is what you feed grows. What you feed grows. So this for us is about leading with our vision and not just being confined to what seems politically realistic, right? We have to be both visionary and oppositional at the same time. If all we do is fight against what we don't want, we learn to love the fight and only have longing for our vision. We can't afford that. So what you feed grows. The second principle is if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. Can I get an amen? And that's essentially like culture moves faster than politics ever has, right? The role of cultural work is critical. It's not just an afterthought of our movements, it's the central piece, right? People can't go where they haven't been in their minds. And culture takes us there. It makes us believe that we can take risks. It makes us believe that the movement we're building can be irresistible, that the community we're building and the world that we need is irresistible. Right? So we have to organize to change the story, to change the narrative. The third principle is if it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. Right? This is so critical to what we're celebrating here in 75 years. Without that principle, nothing that we have seen accomplished could happen. If it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. So leading with our vision and a new story, we must actively work to build the world we need, providing for our community's needs in a way that asserts the need to change the rules and contest for power to do so, right? So all of our communities can have access to what they need to build a dignified life, right? So we are asserting the right to change the rules while contesting for power. This is the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. And then the last principle of the Just Transition Framework is if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And it's such an honor to be on a panel with folks who are thinking about what does governing look like, the new regenerative economic systems that we need so bad, right? Because how many times have we won something, gained something, and we're like, oh no, we are not prepared to govern this. So what does it look like to practice participatory self-governance? At what scales, right? And community control systems, cooperatives, land trusts, etc., they challenge what has been ingrained in us by our dominant extractive culture, right? They prioritize the collective good rather than individual gain. So one of the main ways that we see this just transition as a tool for practicing self-governance is that we have to move our resources out of the extractive economy and invest in the appropriate scale solutions controlled by the people. So those are the 4 principles of the Just Transition Framework. And the heart of it is redefining our understanding of economy, right? For us, we start with the idea that just breaking down the root language, so the word eco comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. So ecosystems are all the relationships in our home. Ecology is the knowledge of our home. And economy simply means the management of home. And people have managed home differently across cultures and places forever. So how do we take our globalized management of home and reclaim more dignified, ecologically sustainable, grounded community ways to manage home together? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Deseree. Go. 60 seconds. You're off. And Dr. Blake for our next speaker.
Yeah, our next speaker is Kevin Wyatt. If you look in your program for forum speakers, I want to give you just a few seconds to look at his bio. It is important to understand that all of these bios are shortened bios. There's a lot more that they have done, and I think you'll get that when they speak. I met Kevin a few years ago and was very, very impressed with his work in permaculture. At that time, I know he had some land here in San Francisco, on 16th and Rhode Island? 18th and Rhode Island. The work that he was doing, making fresh fruit available to people. And I was also quite impressed with his understanding of racial justice and different forms of economy. So when we started putting this together and we were thinking about panelists, he was one of the people that just kept coming to me to get Kevin to participate in this. And he's done a lot of work, again, in alternative economies, and it's just a pleasure to have him with us today. So our next speaker is Kevin Bayuk. And Kevin, could you tell us a little bit about what you think about the Mother community and how we might get there and what you're doing to help us get there? Okay.
Transforming the trap of the extractive or exploitation economy, the economy that defiles our relationships to each other and to the world around us, and treats our relatives as objects, and transforming our relationship to the economy where our personal security need not be tied to being mediated by dollars and transactions, but our methods of personal security is a trap, right? So many of us are tied to getting wages to pay for rent or health or food or clothing. And there can be a fear of like, what unable-bodied, what am I going to do then? So this like quest for the systems and the structures that many of us have been born into, which are only available to the affluent world, and definitely, had, because of white supremacy, have been relegated to, made for white people, mainly. And so many of the world's people don't even have access to any form of personal security because of the exploitation of the economy. But it's a trap. And so how do we get out of the trap? I think building viable alternatives with a distinct foundation, a foundation built with the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as leading the foundational structures of the viable alternatives to a fully different type of economy, like the root of economy. And what I mean by structures, I'll give some examples of what that looks like in my work. Supporting organizations like, there's a farm that comes to mind. In this country, of all the farms in this country, there are 14 that are owned by the workers. You must be able to see the invisible. It exists. There's 14 that are owned by the, think of all the exploitation. There's 14 farms that are owned by the workers. There's a farm that I'm thinking of where it's not only owned by the workers, it's also owned by customers who receive food from the farm, and it's also owned by a network of producers in the region. And so it's a multi-stakeholder cooperative structure. This is just a structuring of an enterprise or a group of humans coming together to provide food, but the laborers are paid twice the wage of any of the other farm workers in the region. The food, which is grown organically and biodynamically without need for any government certification, but healthy, nutritious food is available to people that costs less than organic food at the market. How is this possible? The ownership structure itself unlocks the possibility where the community actually is able to gather around a table, literally, big long table, and is able to decide things like, how much should the workers be paid? How much should the food cost for you, for you, for you? And coming together in a governance structure where it's participatory and inclusive to make those types of decisions. This is not science fiction, this exists. It's a farm called Our Table as an example, but it's one of 2 multi-stakeholder cooperative farms in this country. And so that's a type of initiative that some of the work I do with a cooperative called Lift Economy. We help create viable alternatives to the dominant extractive exploitation economy in models that can be regionally replicated and adapted. And there's going to be a plurality, a diversity of expressions of the beloved community and how we might meet our needs. But without being able to see them, which is both a cultural thing and a structural thing. Actually creating the Dudley Streets, the alternatives that happen, when they happen in the world, that's what brings me alive and affirms my commitment to know that the beloved community is imminent, something that can happen. And it just requires us to be able to see it and commit to it with all of our effort. Just for more insight on the work I do on the cultural side, with groups like the Urban Permaculture Institute, we work on supporting community-driven climate resiliency planning our world in this climate moment with sea level rise and extreme storm events and so forth. The resilience and security of our communities, of course, frontline communities, largely low-income communities, communities of color, are most at risk on a day-to-day basis. And so how do we support, and yet literally billions of dollars, the Chronicle just reported $1 billion will be spent to try and protect an international airport in the city of San Francisco, just so that it's not flooded half the time by sea level rise in the year 2080. So $1 billion will be spent, and billions and billions of more dollars will be spent, and most of that resources will be holding on to the existing exploitation white supremacist economy unless we intercede and transform with planning and building power, as well as transforming culturally our relationship to how we meet our needs. So Urban Permaculture Institute builds people's plans with the people being in the lead for local self-reliance. How do we grow some of our own food? How do we take care of some of our own, build our own shelters with our own hands in ways that are resilient and restorative and reparative to nature. So that's some of the work I do. And I also work with, some of the work at Lift Economy is working with affluent world, with white people and with wealthy people, with philanthropy and transforming the culture of people with power to relinquish power, to step back and culturally transform the norms of the extractive exploitation economy. And we do our best to effectuate change from multiple levels and transformation. And I guess I would say just how do we get to the beloved community? It's a wonderful provocation. I don't know, of course, and I'm learning. I could listen all day. I have a lot to learn.
We'll get together.
Yeah, we'll get together. I have a tremendous amount to learn. I think many of us do. And so I don't know the pathway, but I'm committed to the pathway.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, have a good conversation. I'll see you in 60 seconds.
So I think community that model of friendship.
I think that, housing, if you don't have a place to live, it's very hard to get out of I just thought it was so imperative to have I like how she talks about the inside outside.
She's done some incredible work, and I love your anthropological background. That's very, very meaningful to me personally. So, Noni session.
Is it okay? Yes. As a kid, you didn't make any incursions onto the altar.
Yes.
You stayed far Thank you so much for having me. I agree with you on the caliber of the panel. I felt really honored to be invited among these folks. I'm going to try to stay within my 10 minutes. I do have a few things I want to say because although I have some of my comments prepared, I also wanted to comment that there are some parts of my work that almost every step of my work has been affected by the hearts of other folks. And I just wanted to bring light to when we, as a researcher and a little black girl from West Oakland, we decided I was going to run for city council. They brought me to sit with Gus for about 3 hours. And the one thing that stuck with me about his advice for if we were going to run is he was like, throw out all the rules, throw out the rule book. Do not play by the rules of the establishment because you cannot win if you accept the stories that were told and the processes that were given. So we blaze our own trail. Always be grateful for Gus, because we came within 1,500 votes of winning just by breaking every rule. So, I mean, that's the question, right? Like, what is the beloved community, and how does that work? And especially if you're purposely trying to be a rule breaker. So, I'm going to ask us a trick question here. What do the following individuals have in common? My grandma, Katie Mae Humphrey, and her endless church work. My father, Major Session Jr., a grocery store owner and a fisherman. My mother, Carolyn Session, a business owner, self-made. Jim Henson and my friends from Sesame Street. Martin Luther King and the leaders of his time. Huey P. Newton and the food program. Christ, the one who hung with the prostitutes and the street people, who turned over tables in the temple. Buddha, John Rastafari, the Quakers. What do they all have in common? They taught me how to be a friend. They taught me how to show up for others in struggle. They taught me that you stand at the gates of heaven and you hold the door open for others. They taught me that you lay your body down across the muddy puddle so that others can walk across. And despite, you may not know it, but I'm born in 1975. And with my parents as small business owners, I got to hang out in Oakland and watch as the whole landscape changed, transformed, contracted, fluxed. I hung out in front of my dad's grocery store right around the corner from Mandela Grocery Co-op, and watched the firefighters and the doctors and the drug addicts and the homeless people and the rich folks and the folks from the projects, and I saw all of life transpire. And the 90s came and we lost a generation, and we plunged into materialism and a certain version of hopelessness that in some ways took at least my conscious layer with it. And I left that place in 2001, hoping never to come back as a third generation West Oaklander with my fingers crossed, never to return. Because I didn't find the friends and the hope that all of those folks had promised to me, that had modeled for me. All the coloring books that I colored, where Dr. Charles Drew, you color him courageous, and Fannie Lou Hamer, you color her strong. I didn't see that in the 90s. And I left looking for it elsewhere, on other horizons, through finding anthropology that told me that there were friends elsewhere in the world, through my Black Studies major that told me that there were people who were thinking about how to lay our bodies down for one another long before it even occurred to me. And I returned home in 2001, only in my mind for 5 years to finish writing my doctorate so I could leave again and find my place and find my friends. And I found two things over the course of that 5 years. One is I found streets lined with tents. This place that, despite our social and economic struggles, had always been home, was now only home if there was a spot on the sidewalk. And then I also found that that was my calling all along. That there almost needed to be a place of crisis to see the seeds that had been planted for me by the people who came before me. Out of desperation, after founding the State of Black Oakland, we launched a grassroots all-volunteer city council campaign. And going from door to door, taking no corporate money, really being openly committed to building neighborhood assemblies, and an independent cooperative economy, mincing no words about the ways that our city municipalities are not serving us, and in fact throwing the doors wide open for unchecked speculative development, letting our people lay on the curb, coming within 1,500 votes of overturning an entrenched and incumbent in bed with developers. I found over the course of that what was planted under the ground for us. I met people who hung with my dad in high school and got into fights, and I met folks who my mom gave their first job, and I met my brother's mates from high school and girlfriends, and I met my sister's academic competitors, and returning as a little girl who didn't believe that she could find friendship in her neighborhood, and found that friendship had been planted for me all along, and that I was brought back to be the friend and model it. It turned out into the work that I'm doing now, which is really the heart of it. I am the director and one of the co-founders of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, a very long technical name. But our tagline, our motto, is land without landlords. And this, for me, is a statement about where we can go together when we hold each other's hand, when we seek internal transformation, And so critical parts of our work we actually have 3 taglines: land without landlords, restorative economics, and heal people power. So the land without landlords recognizes our need to transform our understanding of land and housing as the thing that draws us together rather than bricks us in behind moats and walls. We decommodify land and housing. We buy it and put it in the hands of collective groups. The restorative economics is about the restoration of wealth building, the redistribution of resources and power and skill sets. And that's something you have to give away freely to your friends. You want your friends to be strong. You want your friends to be able to stand as high as you and not be next to them on their knees. Every time, all the way into my 20s, I was a teenage mother. And during my pregnancy at 17 years old, I spent a lot of time laying in the bed very sad, but also being kept company by another good friend of mine, Mr. Rogers, and by Sesame Street. And they just kept reminding me that that's what we're here for. Like, that's our human potential. We are always attempting to cover up our animal nature, this thing that Western power practices call savagery, that we want to hide under civilization. I have my timer on, I still have a minute and a half. But really our nature is the nature of friends. If you look around at our animal kingdom, we support one another in a very synthesized way. That's the ecosystem. Our third mission pillar, Heal People Power, is about the transformation that's called for from the inside in order to be a friend to our community, in order to be a friend to one another. We can go out as teachers, pastors, nonprofit workers, consultants, and speak and teach, but if we're not transforming our internal practices, our organizational practices, our inclination toward hoarding power, toward elevating the ego itself, there's no way to cause friendship to gain traction among any of us. So we believe at East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative that we're laying a pathway for friendship. We build the networks that are denied our communities to move capital into their hands. We build the projects that our communities have been convinced only belong to large-scale commercial developers and put it in the hands of our community members who we trust. We build skill sets so our community members can work together, resolve conflict, long-term asset manage together as a whole. We bring in community capital, those who have $1,000 to invest into our projects as friends of our community, as those of us who know that we have control over our future if we choose it and if we choose it together. We envision that there will be a cooperative corridor in the Bay Area, in the region, and nationwide, where we know as part of our work principles, as part of our home principles, that our charge is to hold the doors of heaven open to every person that chooses to pass through, and to even love those who do not make that choice, because eventually they will come our way. So thank you so much for being here today, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Noni. Okay, here's your last pair share. 60 seconds. Go. What lives in you? To kind of process that which lands in us after we have heard from this fabulous panel. I don't know about y'all, but I'm so inspired. Let's thank them. Really, that was so great. Gus, Noni, to Brian and his sister, whose name is Evelyn, I think. We have some undoubtedly fabulous food awaiting us downstairs. So I invite you to head downstairs for lunch, and over lunch, consider taking advantage of the opportunity to talk with somebody that you don't know well, and to continue to explore what you heard, what questions it raises, what responses you have. And just know that after lunch, we'll be coming up here to, the next thing that will happen is we'll have an opportunity for our panelists to ask one another questions. And then there's going to be an opportunity for us all to engage in large group discussion.
There's different places of agency and transformation. So certainly as individuals, our own habits, behaviors, and norms in terms of how we conduct ourselves in meeting our needs for ourselves and our family and our community, those are an important place of action and how we might influence people in our neighborhood. But then there's it can be easy to feel cynical sometimes because the systemic nature, or the institutional and systemic nature of oppression and the hidden trap. Remember, I mentioned capitalism is a trap. A lot of the trappings are hidden, or less obvious to some of us. And so, without actually transforming the system as well, and building power from leadership of those who have been excluded from wealth building, from power, without them being in the lead and transforming those systems, I don't think we get to the beloved community just on voluntary individual behavior change. We actually have to dismantle the systems and institutions themselves in order to get there. And my posit would be, just, as a white man, I don't believe white men or white people are going to be able to be the leaders of this dismantling. We're part of it, but we're not going to be the leaders of this dismantling. We have a big role to play, especially voluntarily dismantling white supremacy. But we need to step back, and the leadership of the dismantling, the changing of the institutions and the systems. So if you're feeling cynical, yes, there's big things need to happen, and it can be really big, but you have a role to play at different levels. And so in my share, I didn't talk much about the systems, I don't think. Just wanted to add that.
But let me say, in trying to correct history as it plays, don't limit yourself in what you can do just because you're a white man. One of the things that I have seen constantly, for instance, I applied for graduate school at UC Berkeley when I was mayor, and they said, no, we'll put you on faculty, but you won't come because you will question some of our processes. I said, no, I'm trying to learn the methodology. Same thing happened to me at MIT when I was doing the other street. I became the Martin Luther King Fellow at MIT for a couple of years, teaching a graduate course on alternative development, economics, community development, whatever else, but they would not let me in grad school. So, I had to go along with it. But what I found out, and I want to say one thing, I was on the advisory committee of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, only 5 people. And we were having a discussion one day, 500 mayors talking, 90% of them were white, those days smoking big cigars and fat. And this one guy was talking eloquently. And Doug Frazier from the United Auto Workers was an ex-officio member of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And he told the guy, he said, stop, wait a minute. He said, I'm pretty intelligent, but I don't understand a damn thing you're talking about. You're talking over my head. He said, let me tell you a story. There was an airplane flying from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. It had 5 passengers. President Nixon, Vice President Agnew, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a priest and a hippie. When the plane got over Denver, the pilot radioed back and said, look, there are 5 of you, and only 4 parachutes, and our engines having trouble, we're going down, so make a democratic process, who should be saved? Nixon said, I'm leader of the free world, I should be saved at all costs. He grabbed the parachute, jumped. Agnew said, well, Tricky Dick and Watergate, I may have to replace him. Agnew forgot all about his own tax scam, he grabbed the parachute, jumped. Kissinger said, I'm far and away the smartest man in the whole wide world, Middle East, diplomacy, etc., etc. I should be saying, he grabbed a parachute jump. The priest turned to the young hippie and said, young man, I'm 90 plus years old. You take the final parachute. The hippie said, no, Father. Remember the man said he's the smartest man in the whole wide world? He said, yes. He grabbed my backpack. So don't listen to those who claim to know it all. No one of us knows it all. I'm 84 years old. I learn something new every day. It's together, collective, integration, this and that. No one of us knows it all. So don't you not give up all that you have, brother. But where your spirit's coming from, you're going to be a meaningful part of it anyway.
Yes. Any other responses to the panelists, to each other, or you'd like to add something that you were not able to say?
What's that?
The question was, do you want to add something to what you said before, or would you like to respond to something that somebody
let me
else
speak to
said?
something else.
Because I do have some things I can add if you don't. Okay.
You know, let me just say another thing about the beloved community which you're referring to. I grew up in the beloved community. The black church played a meaningful role in the beloved community, in segregated communities, but everybody was treated equally, whether you had white collar, blue collar, no collar, trying to get a collar. We were treated equally in that church, you know, handicapped, whatever. And it was only after the civil rights was coming to an end, and what was the power they gave blacks to go to college and whatever, what do they call it?
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action. After a lot of those blacks got educated, they moved to the suburbs. Well, that church that they went to originally, they would come back to that church on Sunday. But when they moved out, that church stopped serving the community. And they didn't keep that church serving the community. It was that central role. A beloved community is everybody working together, irrespective of what, with common respect and whatever else. And if we're going to ever rebuild this country, that's got to be about. But of course, democracy and everything else has to be. And of course, our education systems and everything else have to work. But there's that collective wisdom and that approach from a standpoint of love that made the beloved communities what they were. And we got to get back to them. We got a few now, not many. And of course, stop and think about it. I mean, where else in the world could you ever end up, even after all these years of a so-called democracy, having a president like Donald Trump? I mean, it's the most god-awful thing that I have ever seen or witnessed. I'm 84 years old, and my grandmother, tells me about her mother being a slave in this and that. Here we are. I mean, look at Trump. Not only look what he's doing in the Middle East. I mean, the money that he's pumping into Israel and what everybody else did and whatever else. And when you look at the conditions, Berkeley was the first city to divest when I was mayor. I saw apartheid in South Africa. I also saw it in Palestine during the Second Intifada. I got shot at by Israeli police in Ramallah and locked down in Gaza. We Americans don't know enough about what's being practiced and how our tax dollars are being misused at the expense of, and not working with air quality, etc., and everything else. We've got to learn what is a function of a real democratic society, and we got to do it collectively together. And that's why I love coming to this church. I mean, I've known Dorsey since I was mayor and whatever else. Although I was raised in this church, I haven't been a part of the church for a long time, but I just told Joyce, I'm gonna join this church.
Thank you. Again, one of the reasons I wanted us together today, and especially have people from alternative systems going forward, alternative economics, is the fact that there are a lot of different approaches, very creative approaches to our society that are out there, and we don't know about them. And I think if we knew about them, we would have more confidence in going forward. Yeah. What the society is very good at is isolating us, creating silos. So I work on my little project. I don't know what you're doing. But if I knew what you were doing, that would encourage me in terms of what I was doing, and maybe there are ways we could work together, this kind of thing, and build a community. I tell people, remember the Christian church started with just a few people, and they did not depend really on the government. They said they shared what they had with each other, and there was no poor among them. So with all the resources we've got, if we could think about how do we share that, and how do we build that, and how do we support each other, we can do what we need to do, and that is to build a future that is creative, positive, and is open for all, and that works for all.
It could be as simple as a Facebook page.
What's that? Yeah.
It could be as simple as building a Facebook page.
We're going to talk about, you can bring that back to us when we talk about going forward, okay, Dr. Myers? But just listen to this, and it'll be very quick. In the United States, the cooperative sector, which represents over $500 billion in revenues and employs over 2 million people, is surprisingly invisible in the United States. Do you hear them talking about this on CNN? I don't think so. Despite its size, it is seldom, if ever, discussed in business schools or economic programs. Nonetheless, when you mention specific cooperatives or types of cooperatives, most Americans will have had at least some exposure to, credit unions, which are member-owned financial cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, purchasing cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, housing cooperatives. So worldwide, cooperatives are even more significant, representing well over $3 trillion in revenue, 12.6 million in employment, and over 1 billion people in total membership. Within the global cooperative movement, the vast town of Mondragon, which some of you know about, occupies a special place founded in 1956 by Father Jose Maria Armendez Arriata, and they contributed to this, our program today, with some of the things that food downstairs. The Mondragon Cooperative currently consists of 102 federated cooperatives employing over 73,000 people. The vast majority of these worker owners are in the industrial and distribution segments of the economy, competing successfully in global markets. In addition, the Mondragon Cooperative system owns its own bank, university, social welfare agency, several business incubators, and a supermarket chain.
And the insurance company.
Insurance. And just to add to that, there is the cooperative in Cleveland, laundry, and so there are, thank you. So there are wonderful things happening, and happening not only in the nation, but worldwide, and we need to be aware of that. You know, when I was in the late 60s, so we used to talk about power to the people, and some of you heard the phrase, the people united can never be defeated. And I think there's some truth to that. It is how do we unite, how do we come together and build a new kind of movement, which I think is necessary and can be done. So, would anybody like to say anything, or do we go to the audience now for some comments?
I
Yes.
would like to add a couple things that I forgot to mention in my time up there. So there's a couple things on my mind. First, I realized I didn't really give a picture of what Movement Generation does, so I wanted to take a moment to do that. So Movement Generation is part training institute. We do a lot of work on eco-literacy and political strategy with grassroots groups across the country. That's one bucket of work we do, and then we're kind of a movement pollinator is what I like to call it, in that helping to seed and create different vehicles for the world we need. So ING's played a big part in building a climate justice alliance. If folks want to check out that network of indigenous environmental organizations doing some great work. And then the other piece of what we do is cultural production. I just want to say I really appreciated the play in the beginning. We have a web series called The North Pole that's about Oakland and climate change and gentrification. It's a comedy. It's really funny, but it's a big bucket of work that we do. So those are some of the pieces. I wanted to share that. And then another thing that I wanted to make sure we center in this conversation is the role and the need to follow indigenous leadership and knowledge in the work that we're doing. And I wanted to mention Segorite Land Trust, and that we are on Ohlone Chichenyo land, and that model, if folks haven't heard of Segorite Land Trust, they're an urban indigenous women's-led community land trust. They have a settler land tax as one of the tools that they're using to move resources into the work that they're doing and to reclaim sacred and holy territory here. And then they also have several partnerships with different organizations to take back land in the Bay Area and to be in right relationships. So I just wanted to make sure that as we're thinking about the beloved community we need, how do we be in deep conversation and in relationship with all of our different complex relationships to land in place, given the history of settler colonial violence, given all of these different ways and forms, reasons why we're all here through processes of genocide and displacement and imperialism. But being in central relationship with indigenous folks here and around the world, because Native folks hold just like 4% of the land on Earth, I believe, and then are responsible for 80% of the biodiversity that is being defended on this planet. And that is a huge piece. And when we think about what does functioning real democratic governance look like, who better to learn from, move with, than indigenous cultures and indigenous wisdoms and places. So put that forward.
Thank you. I want to, thank you very much. Before you leave, Kevin, I want to ask a question. I want the panel to be thinking about this too, in addition to whatever else you might want to add. What gives you strength to go forward? Because there have to be setbacks. And I know working with people, period, there are disappointments, real disappointments, sometimes even betrayals. What helps you to keep your eyes, when we talk about the feeling, eyes on the prize, what helps you to keep focusing and having the strength to go forward when there is so much disappointment in your work?
Thank you, everybody. Certainly there are setbacks, disappointments. There's just a tremendous amount of hurt in the world. It's every day if I'm truly present with walking around and just seeing people on the sidewalk, or just obscene inequities of what's happening in our world right around me or globally. It's very difficult to, I think, sometimes be present with it. And the honest answer would be I'm still working on coping with being alive and present and sensitive to the world. I don't have the answer, but the strategies that I found most potent for me is to cultivate as much beauty as possible and really see what's working. When I see Noni's session and the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative charging ahead with what they're doing, it fills me up with joy. And there's just so much beauty in some of the great work that's happening, that the beauty in some way, it's not that it compensates for the hurt, but it just stretches out. I feel more able to next day affirm my commitment to the beloved community and do more, give more, serve more, because there is a lot of beauty. And it's easy to forget, it's easy to miss, and a lot of it's invisibilized by culture, but there's a lot of beauty. And this might be a subtle thing as well, but maybe it's personal to me, but I also get my hands in the soil and actually grow food for my family, and actually making the compost and growing vegetables is very important to me, and that kind of sustaining cycle is part of the beauty, I guess, but it's just really personal to me. And I am embarrassed, I'm going to have to leave a little bit early to actually go take care of my daughter, but I wanted to also just share that it's been not only a privilege, but just an honor to share this panel during the summit with amazing people that inspire me. So I'm really grateful for just the opportunity to be here and with you all. I would feel remiss if I didn't mention that the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, if you're looking for ways to create community wealth building, and actually, for some of us who might have $1,000 in savings or are looking at our credit unions and so forth, you can become a community member. It's a real thing that East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is something you can take action. If you're a California resident, you can take action today and invest, become a community owner. And I just wanted to, if some of you are wondering, how can I actually take action today? It's something you can actually do today. So I didn't want to leave without saying that.
Thank you. Could we, for Kevin,
because it kind of transitions into the thing I wanted to say to follow up on Deseree's comments. So how do I keep going in the face of disappointment and even betrayal? The first thing that comes to me, and I know this may, well, maybe not in this room, it may not sound cliche, but in that you forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do, right? And so that's a simpler version, but I'm sure you guys all know people who you're like, nah, that guy knows what he's doing. We could think of one in particular. I'm sure all of us could come up with this guy right now, but he doesn't get that kind of airtime here. So I'll say something a little bit more substantive about that, right? What helps me and helps me continue to struggle with living, as Kevin describes it, right? Where you're like, okay, we're gonna do this day again. All right, we went to sleep. Tomorrow we're gonna get up. We're gonna do this again. Okay, we're here. We're committed to the next day. Is getting further and further into a place to differentiate between the illusion and the reality, right? And you might think the reality is the thing that they call reality, and illusion is the invisible thing, but it's actually the other way around. Getting clarity that the stories that we are told, the conditions that we are caused to experience on this material plane are constructed conditions meant to interrupt our evolution, meant to block our transformation. And it is structured to draw off that transformative energy and put it toward these hypermaterial processes like wealth accumulation, like space exploration, like mass fast production, where the shirt you buy tomorrow is thrown away next week, right? Our transformative energy is drawn off, distracted, and turned toward these base processes. That's the illusion, right? And the reality is where we find our transformation, where we find hope, where we find change, where we find ourselves not able in collectives, specifically collectively, collective knowledge, collective work, collective emotions, we find blocks to those forces that would draw off that collective energy. So for me, that flows into the original thing I wanted to say, to build on Desi's drawing our attention to really transformative work like the Shumai land tax from Segoria Day, work like Movement Generations, if you haven't read from tanks to, what's the title?
From banks and tanks to cooperation and caring.
From banks and tanks to cooperation and caring. That gives structural direction to us for those who are seeking transformation. Or Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy that gives us personal direction for transformation in our external work. And the reason that activated, because that was something I forgot to talk about, was land, was the significance of land and how that functions for community, for a beloved community, and in relationship to our Native folks' effort to reclaim that really sacred function that land plays in building community, in holding memory, in grounding cultural practice, in becoming the well to dip into for material, for your own healing and evolution, and to pass on to future generations or new strangers who come through the door. Land is the critical element through which that's accomplished, which is why Black Americans have been made such a vulnerable population, because there is no land base to resort to for cultural material, for political grounding, for generational inheritance. right? So when we're talking about where do we find the will to go on, where do we find hope in the face of daily betrayals, that there's a reality here that we forget. So people say to me on and off that the planet is doomed. The planet is not doomed. Please, everyone, know that the earth will be fine when our pinky-sized time on this planet ends. If it ever is, if it ever does. We don't actually really know, right, how many cycles humans have been through, right? But if it does end, the earth will continue and regenerate because it is the land. It holds the memory, it holds the energy, it holds the it holds the movement, right? Within its core, it continues to move and change, right? Within its systems. So if we're looking for a way to keep ourselves vital, to keep ourselves from being dismantled, we've been dismantled through the holding of land by power holders, by capital accumulators, right? And the literal ground upon which cultural battles are fought and won is land. So, okay, thank you. I've lost my place. This is where I've been trying to go. Forgive me for drawing this out. When you guys are engaging with people around this thing they call the housing crisis, this is the difference between reality and illusion, right? The conversation that is deployed over and over again is this idea of production. We need more housing. Can we build ourselves out of the housing crisis? Will density change our outcomes? Except recall or know, maybe for the first time some of you, that there are 20,000 empty luxury units in the San Francisco Bay Area. The modifier is luxury units. The housing crisis is not a result of a shortage. It is a result of folks hoarding resources, refusing them to distribute them to the folks who have paid taxes, to the municipalities and the infrastructure that made these resources possible. Municipalities refusing to cause these market actors, human beings, not an invisible hand, human beings making daily, structural, repetitive, policy-based choices. Our municipalities refusing to cause them to share public resources with the public. The crisis is not in a shortage, the crisis is in a distribution, and that is the difference between the illusion and the reality. These luxury units built 40 stories in the high, they're not visible to you and I on the ground floor and my guy in the tent. But know that they're there, and our cities owe us our public resources back. That's what gives me hope, is that we can unveil the false reality placed over what is real, that it is place that grounds us, and it is our connection and our willingness to fight for one another over and over again in the midst of disappointment, because we are conditioned, we are neurologically programmed, we are emotionally programmed, we are symbolically programmed to overlook the very truth that stares us all right in the face. And when we can find our courage, find our hope, and forgive those who have not found that pathway yet, that's what helps me get through the next day. I forgive me, and I forgive you.
Did you want to say something?
No,
go ahead.
You want to respond to the question?
No. Yeah, but you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Noni. Similarly, for me, what helps me get through today, I was actually going to nerd out and say geologic time. like when I think about how long the planet has been around without us, and that dinosaurs lived way longer, and then like with their own phases of evolution and extinction before we even appeared, I was like, okay, like that to me, there's a deep humility that comes in that knowledge, that knowing that if the story of the earth was a book, we would be like the last word on the last page of the last chapter. As a species.
think we're the last chapter.
Maybe not even, no, in the current chapter. Because it's not, we're not an inevitability. Is something that's like the place of beauty that I find, just to realize that we have a culture that is bent on eradicating diversity, right? That is bent both in creating monocultures of the soil and of our minds. And none of it is really based in natural systems, right? Because there's so much diversity. Like, we say it in our work that biological and cultural diversity is the ruler with which we can measure the crisis that we're in. That piece, biocultural diversity, is the key to our resilience. So being able to engage in what does it look like to protect, defend, and to communicate about the deep diversity of this planet is something that just gives me so much joy. I'll just share an example. Something I like to tell everyone about is avocados. So avocado flowers, by day, they present what I pollen-producing flowers, which we have named in our Western mind as male. And then by night, they present fruit-producing flowers, which we have named in our Western mind as female. And throughout the day, they're just changing genders constantly. They're just on the same plant, and it's a beautiful thing. And that's just like one piece. And then there's just, across all of life on this planet, there's a deep, beautiful diversity, and that beauty and that knowledge keeps me going.
Woo.
I love avocados.
Let me just speak to three things. I am so proud of the young people who are out here demonstrating about the climate and whatever else. That young girl from Sweden, I can't recall what her name is, but she's just brilliant. We need to create an arc between an intergenerational arc to follow and give support. The reason I got to do all the things I did is because the older generation kept us from being thrown under the bus.
Amen.
But be careful about what you say about this earth and regeneration, because Bishop Tutu, after the Copenhagen Accord, was interviewed on CNN. And he said, Bishop Tutu, there's all this talk about climate warming and what's happening now. Do you think that no matter what, from generation to generation, that the earth will be there? He said, look, we have racism and homophobia and all kinds of stuff that people don't get along with, but eventually we can negotiate and win those things. But Bishop said we ain't got but one planet. And if we don't take care of that, everything else we do is for naught. So as we're talking about things, we got to put all those things in perspective and know what we're talking about and listen to the scientists. I think about two things. Berkeley was the first city to divest from South Africa when I was the mayor. And we learned other things. And then the Jewish and the Palestinian students from UC Berkeley created a Measure E that said that if it passed, I would write a letter to the President and Secretary of State that the U.S. quit put money into building in the settlements and whatever else. The amount of money that was poured into Berkeley to defeat that was unbelievable. But it was the beginning of some kind of understanding. The other thing is I knew Harvey Milk, who was the first gay on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. I was working next door to the building where he got assassinated at. And he had put an initiative on the ballot in San Francisco to create domestic benefits for gay couples. Dianne Feinstein became the mayor after Moscone was killed. She went to the Catholic Church and stopped that. Harvey Milk's replacement came to me and said, Gus, we think you're the only mayor in America that can pass domestic benefits. But these are what we're up against. First thing I did was go to a very progressive Catholic priest, Father Bill O'Donnell. We used to call him Lily Coach Jackberg. And I said, Father Bill, our LGBTH friends want us to pass domestic benefits. What do you think? His first word, Gus, it's all about love, isn't it? I said, yes, we're going for it. I went to the Central Labor Council, and I got them to buy into it. Then I sent two of my staff down to the state capitol to look at the actuarial tables, because the right wing was saying, if we pass domestic benefits, Then that's gonna throw budgets all out of balance. Found that was a lie. We put it on the ballot, and who else came to campaign with me? Jane Fonda and Holly Neer. We passed the first time in the country, and now it's all over the country. Just one last thing, when I was in Alabama last week, Jane Fonda was there, and it was all about environmental stuff, looking at some stuff. So I've been using my cane, and Jane campaigned for me when I was running for mayor the first time. The day that I took office, I come to my office, all these television cameras out there, I said, what the hell's going on? And Jane Fonda's sitting at my desk when I got there. But last week, when I saw Jane in Alabama, she was out there campaigning from an environmental standpoint because of the kinds of water problems you got in black, small communities in Alabama. But Jane saw me with my cane and said, Gus, what are you doing with that cane? I said, well, I had a knee replacement. You know, I used to play that stupid game of football. She said, Gus, I've had both knees replaced and both hips. And I'm going, and meanwhile, that afternoon, there was a press conference, a little black girl was climbing up in the tree. Jane Fonda at the age of 82 was climbing up in that tree after.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Well, now it's time for you to ask questions or share comments with us. So it's now open to our other participants who are not at the table. Sure.
My idea about the Facebook page, I just went online and joined the Facebook page for the Fellowship Church.
Oh, great.
So you can join, it's there.
Thank you.
If you want to share community information, you can become a part of that Facebook group.
Anyone else? Excuse me, Libby.
When you're talking about bringing about change and helping inspire people to think in new ways, my experience is you have to give them an experience of what can make that happen. Talking about it is one thing, but people need to experience getting to know the other. Right now, there's so much alienation between different communities. And until we sit down and hear each other's stories, and we know that the power of story is very important, that is what enables somebody to move from their tribe or their community into the other, and to get to know them. And that's the beginning, that's sort of the entry point in being able to work together and cooperate. And the other thing that I would add is that I read a book, I think it's called The New Story by Charles Eisenstein. Do any of you know who he is? And he says that even if we solve the climate crisis and figure out how to live within the lowering the footprint in time, it's not going to solve the big picture. The big picture is what you've been talking about today with racism and economic differentiations, the poor, the rich, our whole system of banking and who the haves and the have-nots. If all of these problems aren't solved together, the climate crisis is just one. So we have to really look at the whole big picture because everything is interconnected, interrelated, interdependent. We're all one. If we don't live that way, it's not going to work.
Thank you. I think Felix.
First of all, I want to thank the panel.
Yes.
I've learned a lot today. I've gained a lot of insights today. I'm in Mayor Newport's generation. It's really good to have deep-seeing young people to teach us. So thank you for that. Noni, in your formal presentation, I remember you ended by saying that if you live a righteous life and you get to the gates of heaven, you will hold the door open for those that follow you, and those that choose to do so will do so. And those that decline the invitation, you would still open the door for them because they will come around. Is that a figure of speech, or do you believe that literally? Do you believe that the arc of the universe bends towards justice? Do you believe that if I forgive you and if you forgive me, one day I will forgive you? How preordained do you believe these notions are?
interesting you ask that, because for a while, I have a habit of when I sit down with strangers, sometimes I have a question on deck, and for about a year, that was my question: do you believe that the universe arcs toward justice? This is, I guess, a pretty unsettling question out of the blue from a stranger. What I believe is that I have seen in my life our ability to love a person into submission, if you will. Folks who began as my enemies, or an enemy even, I don't even embrace that as mine. Folks who began or appeared to be an enemy after some time, maybe years even, of behaving and demonstrating my intention to never be an enemy, despite failing at that again and again. I've seen folks transform. And I've seen other folks whose path on this planet, chosen or ordained, has been to stand in between myself and others in that transformation. I think there will unfortunately be some folks who will live and die on this planet blocking our evolution, and some who will get on or off that path at different times. Does it arc toward the good? I don't know when my young boys in the Congo are being forced to mine coltan for all of our iPhones. I don't know the answer to that, right? I can meditate and generate a reality here for myself in this relatively safe place. But my young person in the Middle East, maybe the job is more daunting because the vibration is so deeply off at the Gaza border that it's going to take more than it takes for me to cause my co-op to be able to serve people in the community. But I do know that we all have a choice, and sometimes that choice, there's a scripture too, have you been faithful unto death? Sometimes that choice will end in our destruction. But like, what is destruction? Who guaranteed us this life? That's very cavalier from a privileged Western perspective. And also, it's my privilege to be able to sacrifice this thing that I was given for this moment. So.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Brought up for me, on my way here, I was thinking about that phrase, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, because when we present the just transition framework, we often say transition is inevitable, but justice is not. And that for us looks like, a system that extracts from a finite planet faster than that planet has the ability to regenerate is going to collapse. And for us are we going to have total collapse or intentional reorganization, right? Because we could look at, the other side might want to pretend, or has been, that they don't think the climate crisis is real, right? But they're preparing for it, and every time there is a shock in the system, whether it's Katrina or Puerto Rico, they're there ready to privatize everything, right? Yeah. And it's, for us, if we're moving towards regenerative economies, how do we harness those shocks towards community-controlled systems, right? Transition is going to happen, and the ways in which we're ready to respond to them is where the potential for justice is for me. Like, I think that phrase is about the potential for justice, and that transition is inevitable and constant, right? That's one of the mantras of Octavia Butler, like, God is change is one of the things that's coming to my mind right now, but that's something that's kind of struck a chord with me, is thinking about in what ways does that idea affect how we participate intentionally? Like, are we just waiting for for the good life to happen on the other side of the hellscape, you know? Or are we participating in bringing about that good? What is the energy we're trying to move forward?
Yeah, that actually evokes something you brought up in your presentation, which I thought was critical at this transition point, right? That if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win, right?
Yes.
And I've seen that even in our campaign, something very interesting happened at the very end. There's an alumni group from our hometown high school, and being an ostracized kid, I fought very, very hard for their endorsement. And they held a lot of political power in our housing projects. And so I knew that if I got the endorsement of our high school alumni association, we had 4,000 people in our housing projects that were underserved, and there would be no question that we would cross the finish line. And the day after I got the endorsement, they called me into a meeting to let me know the things they expected of me, which I thought was actually super awesome. I'm sure that the expectation would be contingent, but I thought this is where we're headed, is working together. Tell me your expectations. And my expectations then, okay, what can I expect from you? How many vans do you have to turn people out to the polls? How many door knockers are you ready to provide? And the answer was 0. The answer was 0 because we are not preparing ourselves to govern. We're imagining this heaven after hell. We're demanding that our leaders set us up for heaven after hell. But we're not setting ourselves up to govern ourselves, to create a heaven out of the sparse opportunities that we get at every arc and every cycle. We have material. The earth gives us back materials. As we deplete it very quickly, it creates other opportunities. We just found coltan. It's fueling a technological revolution. So we could cause this revolution to grow people and strengthen people, or we can keep letting little boys dig it out of the ground and people smuggle it across the borders and sell it illicitly so we can surf Instagram, right? So thank you for the governing part, and that's the critical work that we do, is we're looking to build out righteous and radical governance structures. So when the opportunities come, we're ready for them. So we're already transformed. So we're behaving as the reality that we believe in, that we intend to have. And we're not waiting and guarding and accumulating so that when the reality comes, we're the richest ones there.
Well, amen.
So that's it, yeah.
My name is Gideon Mboi, PhD student at GTU from Kenya. So, Salam Salam Jambo. Good to see you. Is she my side? Because of that. So my question is in 2 parts, and one of them is I was recently listening to Kelly Douglas, who is a woman's theologian, a lecturer at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and she was giving a lecture in honor of Martin Luther King. And then she said how there are some things that have changed, and so there are things that Martin Luther King, those things would not happen then, but things that would happen differently now. And you know how things are. So I'm thinking my question to you as an international student, as an immigrant is, how come we are not moving ahead? We're not moving forward like things are the way they were in the 60s? Critical issues still. Where is this demon at? Like what needs to be done to exercise the demon? So like are we, and I'll use a phrase I used today in response to some other students in a Moodle post today. Is our civilization and advancement progressing backwards? And why? Like, in the midst of all this talk about moving forward. And then secondly, what opportunities do you see, and even here, for international or global partnerships? And I ask that as an African. You're crying about how you don't have land to go and sacrifice and pour libation to your ancestors. So in Africa or Kenya, we have all the land that you need. But, particularly the black folks, with all the talks about beloved community, we are together, we are blackness. But we know, in my 5th year here in the US, I know that the fault lines are obvious, but no one will talk about them. So you may not say, call us shitholes like Trump, but you know inside yourself that you will not come to Mombasa for vacation because of the reason that you know about. You would rather go to France. How can we, what are the opportunities for partnerships where you can use our land so the capitalists don't come there to torture us and take advantage of us, while you guys, the liberals, are staying safe and looking down on us without saying it. So what are the potential partnerships that there are between you guys and us globally for change? Thank you so much. Long questions, but I came all the way to come and ask. Thank you.
I think you should respond to that first. The other one, but
Let's see.
Brother, I agree with the way you stated that. My concern is, though, that we all need to understand leadership from our countries, wherever it's from. I was drafted into politics, and 8 years later I got out because I could not stomach the role of elected officials, government, and whatever else. You do have the land, but it would be great if the people of Kenya could make sure that their leadership would be willing to do this on a cooperative level, rather than what China has come and done already in Africa or whatever else, and how land is controlled. Understand, elected officials in the United States, 92% of all campaign funds comes from developers. That's how the land is controlled in this state. So when I say we have to have analysis of history, what really took place, what are the ways things have to do, you and I, from the other parts of the world, we would have to come collectively to understand what we on the ground, just like she said, these people endorsed her, but they weren't ready to go out and do anything. When I got in office, I won by the biggest plurality after. But when it became time to do things, the people said, Newport, you got it, you can take it. You don't need our help. There has to be a consistency of people from all places doing that was objectively good for the good of brother and womankind, whatever else. I mean, going back when I was talking about our Constitution, do you realize the United States had something called the Equal Rights Amendment years ago? We've never passed that. Women are not considered equal yet in this country. It only takes 2/3 of the legislation to make things like that. It's not even talked about now. And so we have to collectively dig deep and have an analysis of the baseline of starting. I like what you say, but we have to know from both sides of the ocean how we make that happen.
Is there anything else? Anybody else? Okay, a response? Yes.
Thank you for that, friend. I had a couple of things. Those are critical questions. One thing I want to remind us all is how tuned in and brilliant small children are. And as we get older and become programmed by the ways that things happen on this planet, we lose our wisdom and we lose our connection. We devolve in a certain kind of way.
Yes.
And we spend our whole trajectory trying to get back to that place of knowledge and connection that we entered from the womb with. The next thing I want to say is to remind you that every country on the continent, which you know as a Kenyan person yourself, has a different pre-European history and peri-European history and post-independence story, right? Where we've got socialism in Tanzania, we've got capitalism in Kenya, and so many variations in between. So for example, right now in Ghana, it's the year of return. And our co-op is actually right now as we speak on a mission to Ghana, connecting with other Ghanaian co-ops. Really fertilizing a radical vision of co-labor and co-work. But as well, from my doctoral work is in Kenya, so I lived there for a couple of years, and I lived in Tanzania and Mombasa for a couple of years. And I know, because the reality was not hidden from me as a young person with parents who were Pan-Africanists, that is not an S-hole place to go. I've actually never set foot in Europe, but in multiple African countries, which is not typical. But what we're talking about is an access to truth, and an access to reality, and an access to transformation. That we came here close to transformation as small children, and as we moved across this arc, we got further and further away from it, right? And I also know from my experience with the political process in Kenya that if I'm sure you've heard of it, but if other people have not heard of it, that there's a big problem in our home country with the post-colonial complex, where it's not that we want to overturn power, we want to become the power that dominated us. You can't seek to dominate after having been dominated and believe that that is a pathway to transformation. And we've lost that revelation in our home countries, that the reason we kicked out the colonizers was to take ourselves back to wholeness. And instead we've adopted, in many ways, moving more and more across the planet, the same patterns, the same thirst for accumulation, the same worship of this fiat currency called the dollar, the same over-attachment to Eurocentric ideas of beauty that destroy the psyche and destroy the cells and destroy the generations that follow us. So if we're asking about how to partner, we have to heal to be partners with one another. And then the story they tell African immigrants when they come to these states, and the story they tell Black Americans, we subscribe to those stories. Like, I can't know if you hate me until I've talked to you, right? And you can't know the same thing either. So this idea of why we can't be partners is almost the illusion itself.
Amen.
There's nothing that holds us back except for what our hearts have adopted from the stories we're told. And I found lots of partners in East Africa, and I have found lots of enemies in East Africa, and the same way here in the Americas and everywhere else I've been. So I just wanted to respond to that.
Thank you for that response.
We have a limited time, and I did want, if you don't mind, to get some more questions. I know David had a question, Karen and Dorothy, Rick, if we can sort of say those so we can quickly respond to this question. Then we need to end it with that because we're running late in terms of time. So, David. David.
I think you've laid out some beautiful and powerful alternative models and examples of what could be happening on the community level that need to be multiplied 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. And if we're to get to the beloved community. And what do you, I'd just be interested in hearing more about your vision of what needs to be done to try to multiply those by 10, 100 times so that the whole society and the whole world can get a better vision of what they could also follow. Thank you.
So
maybe let's take all the questions and then we can respond to it. Okay.
Well, thank you for a magnificent panel. I'm so sorry I missed. I had a United Nations Association meeting, and then I had to read for Moby Dick, the Moby Dick Marathon. So I didn't get in here until I heard Dr. Blake speaking. But his poignant words, I think, were centered on so much that you had already covered. That is to say, democracy is working towards the collective. This is as I understood. I'm not sure that was, and I want to know exactly where we are with, you are obviously in charge of a cooperative, and that to me, I heard so much about that in the past, cooperatives and collectives and The Firm, the great movie. And I'm thinking, that was always the way we needed to march. And where are we now? And I hear so many little bits and pieces of what civilization represents today. Kenya, magnificent, the wonderful African continent that is being jeopardized. We have child labor and privatization, and we have this neo-colonialism still going on that needs to end. We need to end the labor of children, whether they're getting chocolate or they're getting Coltrane. You know, this is wrong, and we all know it. And one tiny thing I want to say, I mourn very much the passing of our representative Cummings. And I think we can't afford to lose people like that. And then I say, but I look at you and I look at the remarks being made today, and I think we can do it. We can do it together. But how do we do it? That's my question.
I too want to thank you very, very much. I learned a lot, and I have a lot more to learn. I saw a really interesting film earlier this year made in California, and it is about a little farm north of Los Angeles. And it has a lot to tell us, I think, about us as human beings together and us as people living in this country. And it's called The Biggest Little Farm. And if you haven't seen it, it is beautifully done. It's over about 7 years of a couple who want to take the land that has been killed by very bad farming techniques, and they rebuild it. And it is very symbolic, I think, of how we can come back to learning truly how to live together and how to have a way of having our voices heard. And I really am very, very grateful that I was here today, and I want to thank Alice again for inviting me here. It's my 93rd birthday tomorrow, so we're going to celebrate.
Thank you all. Something that is resonating a lot with me, some of the things you're saying, Noni, that it's kind of, we've talked, but it's gotten shadowed over by a lot of things because it relates to my work, is the neurophysiology of fear and how that's based on survival. And that is a key to me in all this speaking of transformation. And what we want to do is intellectual. But the intellectual also, it speaks how it's dealing with this undealt with survival that we have and the fear and the losses that we're going. So it's the ones that are clinging are based with fear, and the ones that need to speak up are also based with fear to have my voice, and they all go back to survival because of the feeling tone of survival. When we deal with the fear of death, is we will do anything to not feel it. And yet it's the only way out to allow the neurophysiology of our body to feel it, to see that we don't die. And that is transforming into how I can then speak to you. Because something else that you said, because when we will be betrayed because of the delusion that we live in, it's not possible to not have that. And so how do I stretch my heart in the midst of betrayal and have forgiveness because of the delusion of the mind that we live at as human beings? That to me is what I find. I forgive the delusion of human beings, not the action. But I can forgive the delusion because I have to deal with the same mind that creates the delusion to get out of the delusion. And that is the difficult part. because it's because it's neurophysiological. And I feel there's a piece for me in all this, and I love it, that if that also has to be dealt with, or we're not changing it. It just keeps repeating itself. And how do we deal with expanding our heart and the nervous system and stretching it so I can be okay hearing you and you can be okay hearing me, and neither of us will die. So that's just a thought, and I appreciate what you've been sharing around that.
Oh, sorry. No, that's okay. It's okay. I'll try to be fast.
What we probably need to do is just get your questions out and not being able to answer.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Food for thought. First of all, I'm just full. What a luminous panel. Thank you all so much. I do a lot of work with youth activists. I also spend a lot of time with elders in the movement and have found both of those to be incredibly rich experiences. Trying to bring them together is tricky. Conversations often don't go well. Actions are even a little bit more tricky. I spent this summer with a pretty well-known civil rights organization that tried to bring in young people and it blew up. So my question is, I want us to think across generations. I'm not sure if the term intergenerational is where I'm going, but I see the power of young people and the energy, but I also feel the weight and the burden we're putting on them. I think about Greta Thunberg saying, I shouldn't be here, I should be in school, right? So a way in which we're placing the burden of making them, our children, fight the battles that we didn't, or we set those stages. On the other hand, I see eldership is not necessarily valued as it was. So I guess my question is, and particularly because I'm looking at the audience, I think it's probably, I'm sort of on the verge of eldership myself. What is the role of elders at this time? How do we sort of bridge these two, maybe it's not even two, it's like how do we sort of build movements across generations in which everyone is lighting their torch and doing the work, because that's what's needed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I have a statement to make, but is it all right to make a statement?
Make a statement.
Quick. Sure. You know, we talk about neuropsychology and all that. Basically, we have to admit we are part of nature. And the capitalist class has taken over as the godfather of nature. And they keep on concocting all kinds of psychology. You remember in the 30s, 20s, they came up with definitions of ethnic minorities being so inferior and other things. And the Roxbury Foundation also had something about the Jewish thing. And then when the Anglo-Saxons went all over the world, the first colony was Ireland. And you can ask the Irish guy how they defined the Irish people. When they went to India, when they went to Middle East, became sand niggers. When they went to Africa, first of all, they made them into niggers. Went to Middle East, made them sand niggers. So what they do when they go to India, we were brown niggers, you know. So all this psychology and everything is pumped into the heads of the great white hope. And today you see Trump doing the same damn thing, you know. So when we talk about mindfulness, we completely forget that the root cause of our problems, stress, distress, violence, is the capitalist system, based on private profit making and accumulation of wealth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists again. First, I want to say Noni has to leave. She has been very gracious because she's had a cold, and her energy level, although we can't tell right when you're speaking, but she does need to leave. and then we'll go into our next session, where I think Steve is going to introduce Bayuk. Okay? But we want to thank our panelists again. How extraordinary. Really extraordinary. I think we can do better than that. Thank you.
World needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. We are going forward, and what we're going to do now, just very, very briefly, because I know we're in a bit of a time crunch, is we have two members here in Fellowship Church who've been engaged in work in the wider world. And this church has been engaged in work throughout the community and beyond San Francisco for many, many years. So I want to invite Vahi Razavi up just briefly to talk about his organization called Ethics in Tech. And there is a book downstairs that he wrote, and you can look on the literature table for it. Vahi, would you come on up for a moment?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's really excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I have a request. It's end of the day. Why don't you all take your cell phones out of your pocket? If you got them on you, unlock them, and then pass it to the person to your left. Let them go through the photos, its content, its browsing history, share what you have in your messages with your loved ones.
I don't understand it too well myself.
I think what you should recognize is in the eyes of the NSA, they already have that data. When it comes to Big Brother watching, the fact that we're here today talking about this topic could be flagged and could be used as information down the road against us. Our privacy is an illusion. Google has your search history, Facebook has your social media history, the Snapchat and the rest combine data on user behaviors. So I'm here today to talk about ethics in technology. One aspect of it is privacy, but there's been a lot that's been done in the name of progress and in the name of tech that is outright embarrassing. Did you know that a computer science corporation, a company with US defense contractors, was responsible for rendition flights of torture of Khalid al-Masri in 2013 across Europe? You know that our own friends here at Salesforce and the Salesforce Tower are providing software to CBP and Border Patrol for the immigration centers that are built and detention centers, which should be really called concentration camps. This is what's taking place in the name of progress. We live in Silicon Valley. We have a responsibility to address what takes place in our cities. And we have a responsibility to engage with the larger community. If you want to be a guide for the next generation, start with the folks in Silicon Valley and guide them. You know, we're a small nonprofit. We just started this year. Thanks to Reverend Blake and the support of this church, we held a few events. We're going to come back in December. We have 2 events. One is a comedy show here at the Church of Fellowship of All People. It's called the Big Tech Comedy Roast on December 13th, where we make fun of big tech. The other one is December 14th in Palo Alto at the Unitarian Universalist Church. The goal here is to address the issues in technology and also bring some comedy into it so people come and attend these events and get informed. Any other way you'd like to support us, from volunteering time to donation, we would welcome it. And I know we are on very limited time, so Thanks for the opportunity, and hope you guys can make one of our events.
Thank you, Wyatt. You're very extraordinary work. It really is. Thank you, Wyatt.
Martin Todd Allen, who we had seen this morning, is Reverend Fisk. He's a founder of Ecofuturism. And Ecofuturism strives to move congregations, and I guess you're mostly working in the San Jose area in Silicon Valley, beyond the sexist, racist, fascist, and capitalist politics of the status quo towards a future free of political oppression and ecological destruction. So Todd's going to come up and say something about his group briefly.
Yes, I was told I only have 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, I'm going to pass around this brochure to everybody in the room. And I'm going to talk, and I'm going to drive my partner crazy because I'm talking around the room.
I got the.
I'm going to go back here and say this. Dr. Howard Thurman said in his, when he was writing back originally to Dr. Fisk, he said this, Reverend Fisk, "We must not hamper the creative form that the Spirit of God may inspire by clinging to the patterns which we are ordinarily familiar."
Yes. Wow.
There are, I estimate, over 3 million people who are part of churches similar to Fellowship in the United States. That's just a number I came up with. Those are churches that would be called progressive. They might have a pride flag out front. But the problem is we're not organized. Congregations are not organized. And they don't get the good kind of stuff we just got to know what to do. So our organization we're putting together the Ecofuturist Manual to train congregations to move away from the idolatry of whiteness, maleness, straightness, and neoliberal capitalism. So I like the fact that the story began today with Dr. Fisk saying, the church in America has a problem. Let's try to address the church first, rather than just looking out of the problem. How is the church complicit with all of these things? If you take your brochures and open it up, it says these are some ways that the church is complicit with inequality, inequity, and inecology. Okay? And so if you get a chance, on the back page, I'd like to know how you can join with us. It says, only by standing hand in hand can we ever free the land. So if you could give me your contact information, that's the beginning of us connecting. If you'll just simply put your name, email, that's enough. Okay? And what we're doing is, the second part is Ecotheologica Encyclopedia, so that all these great conferences and sermons can be in one spot where people are addressing the greatest crisis of our time from a religious and theological perspective. That's what we're working on. Okay? So I'd love to hear from you if you get a chance to fill that out and turn it back in. Thanks. Was that 5 minutes? That was more than 5 minutes.
Yes, I also like to say Reverend Martin Todd Allen is also associate minister to the Fellowship Church. And again, I mentioned that Noni had to leave, and Deseree
He's going to give me a ride.
He's going to give her a ride home.
I just asked him, why don't they preach at our church sometime?
Well, you're reading my mind.
We really need to have you come down and speak to us. Please come.
Yes.
Please come.
Thank you again so much, Deseree and Noni. Okay.
Desiree, will you sign this video on this one?
I got you.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, great, thank you all for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's the thing. Before we close, we want to do two things. The first is to just invite a nanosecond of reflection from each of us, right? This has been a very powerful day. I personally have heard a lot that has really stirred my heart and my mind and my spirit. It's rich. There's a lot here. There's a lot that's possible. There's a lot that's already happening. And rather than just disperse, can I invite you to just take a second to think for yourself? Is there any so what for you today? So there's been this day that we've had together. Is there anything in you that says, so I want to do this? Is there some urge in you to take some action, to do something? That's the question that I ask. And then in 30 seconds, I'm just going to see if anybody wants to share anything that comes up for them as a kind of a so what. And that's going to last for a total of about 4 minutes. And then Dr. Blake and I are going to invite you to close with us in a collective gesture. So I'm just going to put the microphone away from my mouth for 30 seconds and invite you to just reflect for yourself. Is there something that is stirring in you that you want to mostly say to yourself? Like, I intend to do this thing. I intend to follow up on this feeling, this thought, whatever it is. And then I'm going to see if anybody wants to share whatever that thing might be. So here you go for 30 seconds.
Well, at the moment we did.
Can you wait, please?
30 seconds.
I'm sorry. This is 30 seconds of quiet while people results of something you've experienced today. Liz.
I work in climate action, and I'm going to be doing some more reading on Movement Generation's site and about just transition and bringing that to the organization that I work with in Southern Oregon. Great, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for running with the microphone.
Well, I've learned how that the San Francisco Land Trust is not alone. I knew that in my head. Today I know it in my head and my heart. And I'm going to go home and do my homework on what Gus has shared and what all the speakers, all of whom are involved in cooperative housing. It's been an interest of mine for many, many years. And I'm going to take everything that I learned and the wisdom and the resources back to my colleagues at the San Francisco Land Trust. So I feel energized and really hopeful.
Right on. Thank you.
We have time for one more.
Sure.
Karen?
No.
You do want to? Okay. Anyone else?
I'm intimidated.
Don't be.
I've been writing murder mysteries with the idea of using sugar coating to get important information out to people who wouldn't otherwise pay attention to it. And one thing that's high in my mind that we didn't get around to specifically today is how where the system is, where the culture is needing to get back to the first people who had custody of this land, who had sustainable
they brought Howard Thurman here. And I understand there's copies of that letter somewhere, or that I'd like to get it, because I've been working with the Proctor Institute. There's two Proctor Institutes. Samuel Proctor was a minister who was in the forefront of the civil rights movement. One of them meets at Haley Farm, where Dorsey went with me this summer. Marion Wright Edelman, the Children's Defense Fund. The other one is in Chicago. But one of the things I've been involved with them is looking at the role that churches could be playing and should be playing from the standpoint of economic development and other kinds of things. And remember, when you talk about land, blacks lost 70% of their land during the predatory Linden fiasco in 2008. It's what we don't know. The banking establishment took advantage of us. And I'm sorry to say, Obama as president didn't do a damn thing about it because he said the banks were too big to take on. But I want to see that letter because I want to look at that process as I'm engaging with people, because the thinking that Howard Thurman did that allowed him to work with the board that brought him here is something very, very special. And it may seem simple, but something I think is a real piece of learning. Thank you.
Well, Gus, you will get a copy of the book with those letters when you join the church.
My mother died in 2011, but every once in a while when I'm doing something wrong with something, I talk to her. And when I said I was going to join the church, she jumped up and down and hoopy. But I didn't know that the minister, unlike Howard Thurman, was going to take advantage of me.
No, that's our process.
Oh, okay.
Not just you.
But I love them. I love you all.
One final thing about so what and what now, what's after this. I'm going to impose upon Dr. Benton because she looks at the email address. But we would like to go forward and keep in touch with everyone who was a part of this forum. And if you have anything to say about the forum and the organizations that were here, my goal is to keep in touch with them to find out what they're doing, to create the bridge between this church and those organizations so that we continue the dialogue of helping them to accomplish what they want to accomplish and perhaps bring the church into helping them to accomplish that. So info@fellowshipsf.org is the email address. And if you go to the church's website, www.fellowshipsf.org, you can find that email address. But please send it to us. I'm sure Reverend Benton will get it to me. And we're going to try to keep this dialogue going so that we can make this more than an opportunity to sit here on a Saturday and get filled with tears and our hearts full, and to actually, perfect a change in this society. I think we all are here because we really feel as though it's needed. So, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. And I just want to say, so I invite you, whatever you were thinking during your 30 seconds of silence, if you didn't speak it, that's perfect. Just hold it and let it guide you. And may you find it leads you to a meaningful place.
I would like to thank everybody, all our panelists, and everybody who attended today. I had the board members to stand earlier, but would you stand again?
And also our committee members.
Yes, I'm going to do that. Right. So these are the board members who are still here. Committee members who are not on the board: Alice, Peter, Steve, Brenda stood for the board. Okay. And I want to say that you met our co-minister, Dr. Benton. Reverend Liz Olson is also associate minister. She's at large in Oregon. Reverend Martin Todd Allen is an associate minister here. Reverend Elena Rose Vera, who is not here today, she was trying to come here, is also a member and associate member. And Reverend Susie Spangenberg. So we have quite a roster of ministers, and you're always invited to come to Fellowship Church for worship service. I want to thank Edmundo for who's going. Edmundo might be joining with Gus because he's also wanting to join the church. So we're going to have a great time. We have the two of them joining. And Courtney, thank you for the videotaping, Brian. Yes.
And the convocation tomorrow, it continues.
Yes, it continues tomorrow. We continue celebrating our 75th anniversary with our convocation tomorrow. It's the 24th annual Howard Thurman Convocation.
What time?
It's at 3 o'clock. We will not have morning service tomorrow because we prepare for the after 3 o'clock. Our guest speaker is Dr. James Abington. Dr. Abington is a well-known choral director, a musician. He is just an amazing person. At Candler Seminary, he will be presented with the Howard Thurman Award, and he will speak. And he will speak on the topic of the Howard Thurman's use of spirituals and other forms of music as liturgy. So I also want to thank the volunteers. That's at 3 o'clock. We'll also have Hope Briggs, the awesome soprano, singing with us. And if you've not heard Pope Flynn, who's the master drummer from Ghana, you need to be here to hear him. And Dr. Carl Blake, our director of music, has organized a community choir. So please come. I want to say also, Dorothy, thank you for coming all the way from Colorado and participating and volunteering for us today. Evelyn Poe, can you hear me downstairs?